It's no secret that Russia's economy is struggling right now. Nearly 3 years into their war against Ukraine, the country seems to be fast approaching a tipping point. At first glance, there's several obvious signs of decay. Inflation in Russia is currently some of the highest the country has ever experienced, indicating that the government is running catastrophically low on cash. And interest rates in Russia are completely out of control, reaching official levels of 21% that are likely to only inch higher in the very near future. But as severe as these things are, they're just a small taste of the internal economic problems Russia is currently facing. What can be seen as mere symptoms of a far more dangerous underlying economic disease. That disease is something known as Dutch disease. According to many prominent economists, Russia is infected with it, and has been for at least 15 years. An infection which is now only being made worse by an overheated wartime economy in Russia. And while by itself this doesn't explain every economic problem Russia has, it certainly helps to explain a lot of them, and why Russia is a lot more vulnerable than many people realize. Dutch disease is no laughing matter. In the past, it's taken down nations with thriving economies, seemingly overnight, even without substantial outside pressures. Combine that with Russia's current situation, including a very expensive war and some of the most extreme sanctions ever placed upon any nation in history, currently working together to crush the Russian economy, and you have a recipe for disaster. Today's episode was sponsored by Incogni. If you're like me, you might get constant phone calls trying to sell you things like an extended car warranty. When that happens, you may feel like your personal information is everywhere, and that's because it probably is. Incogni helps address the source of this problem: data brokers, who are in the business of collecting and selling your personal details, things like your name, address, phone number, and even your online browsing habits, which are then sold to anyone willing to pay. Marketers, background check sites, employers and landlords, or even health insurance companies potentially looking to raise your rates based on your online activity. And what's worse, the data being sold isn't always accurate. Imagine being turned down for a job or a rental, or paying more for insurance, because of outdated or incorrect information someone purchased about you. That's where Incogni, today's sponsor, comes in. Incogni is a hands-free service that removes your data from hundreds of data broker websites, a process that might otherwise take you several hundred hours to complete. It's simple. You sign up, give Incogni permission to act on your behalf, and they get to work, finding, flagging, and demanding that your information be deleted. And it really works. I first signed up for a data broker removal service earlier last year, and the results were far more amazing than I ever thought they could be. Over 150 different data brokers had my information, resulting in a wave of spam hitting my inboxes on a daily basis. But once that was removed, the amount of spam I was receiving fell off a cliff, so I encourage you to try it for yourself as well. If you're ready to reclaim your privacy, now's the time. Use the link in the description and my code Icarus to get a massive 60% discount on your subscription. So what is Dutch disease? Well, to tell that story, we need to briefly go back to the Netherlands in 1959, to an economy that was about to experience what seemed like the blessing of a lifetime, that turned out in the end to actually be a curse. 1959 was the year that the Netherlands discovered the Groningen gas field, one of the largest natural gas fields in Europe, that provided the country with a massive amount of almost immediate income. As the revenues from this natural gas began flowing in, the country found itself flush with cash, and people who wanted to spend it. So far, so good. But the problems began when people examining the economy realized that, while the natural gas industry was doing extremely well, some other key historical Dutch industries weren't doing so hot. What happened was that the Netherlands had begun to shift from a well-diversified economy with things like strong internal manufacturing to an economy that was now building itself almost completely around the money that was coming from selling this natural gas to other countries. The natural gas industry itself, which could offer higher wages than most anyone else, was attracting a big chunk of the country's skilled labor. And as these people began to experience higher income than they were used to, they began doing what people do, spending more money on things like expensive goods and services, say, doing things like eating in restaurants more often. In turn, service sector employees, like those who worked in these restaurants, began to be more in demand, and so they also began to earn more money than they were used to. So they also spent more, and on it went. And as this effect trickled through the entire economy, much of the country began to experience a kind of boom, drawing people away from other traditional and less attractive industries like manufacturing and agriculture, and towards the gas industry and the services that supported it. But it turns out that the rising tide did not lift all boats, and this newfound prosperity came at an unexpected cost. The traditional sectors of the Dutch economy, like manufacturing and agriculture, began to fall by the wayside, unable to attract labor at a price that allowed them to compete on the global markets. And once these industries fell out of favor, they never quite came back into their full luster, as the workers who used to participate in these industries adapted to a new way of life and a new expectation for their standard of living. Other, more complicated factors were also at play, including currency appreciation that also helped to make the domestic manufacturing industry less competitive. Basically, this made it less advantageous to manufacture goods at home than it was to simply import manufactured goods from abroad, contributing even further to the loss of profitability in the Dutch manufacturing sector. But however it happened, the point is, when they discovered a new natural resource, the Dutch economy shifted. The Netherlands, which was once much more diverse, quickly became dependent overall on a single sector, natural gas. This allowed the Dutch to make a lot of money when times were good and gas prices were high, but it left them terribly vulnerable when times weren't good and, for example, global energy prices began to fall. Economists named this phenomenon Dutch disease to describe the negative side effects that can arise when a country gives into the temptation to become overly reliant on a small set of booming industries. Across different nations, Dutch disease can create its problems in multiple ways, and it never shows up in exactly the same form. For example, it can involve the appreciation of currency exchange rates, as it did for the Netherlands, but it doesn't always. And while focusing on just one strong industry can temporarily cause a boom in the nation's overall economy, that doesn't always happen either. Sometimes you just get the weakness without the boom, as you'll soon see in the case of Russia. However, the core problem is always that, one way or another, the country becomes overly centered on easy money, with other industries like manufacturing falling by the wayside, making the country vulnerable if and when the tides of fortune change. Luckily for the Dutch, they're pretty much everybody's friends, or at least few people's enemies, so they've been spared some of the worst potential effects of this kind of vulnerability, with nobody really seeking to take advantage of them or kick them while they're down. But other nations with similar variations of the disease, who don't play as nice on the international playground, haven't been as lucky. Take, for example, Venezuela, a well-cited example of the rapid, sudden, and almost complete collapse that Dutch disease can bring. Venezuela got rich from oil, creating something that at first seemed like an economic miracle. But once that oil became sanctioned due to the actions of the ruling regime, the economy collapsed into a shell of its former self. Millions of people fled the country, and the rest is history, with Venezuela currently serving as perhaps the prime global example of how not to run an economy. Today in Venezuela, despite their massive oil reserves, there are actually gasoline shortages, since the country never even developed enough refining capacity to turn that oil into something useful, because they were just so focused on crude oil extraction. That's Dutch disease at its very worst. And this can happen to any economy that becomes overly dependent on a small number of exports to keep everything else running. As you might have guessed by now, one country that fits this bill is Russia. Russia's economy is a house of cards. Take one small piece out, and the whole thing can collapse. And that's because of something very similar to what happened to the Dutch. But in Russia's case, it's much, much worse, as they have an economy that is actually hauntingly similar to the failed economy of Venezuela. It's well known that Russia is basically built on just a few major industries. The country makes most of its money by exporting crude oil, natural gas, and rare earth metals, most of which are found in the vast Siberian wilderness. Russia trades these natural resources to make profits that it then uses to purchase finished goods from other countries, meaning that most of the products that Russians consume come from outside their borders. In perfect circumstances, this can work well. But like Venezuela, Russia's vulnerability becomes apparent when you realize that they are so focused on exporting their raw materials that they don't even have a sufficient domestic refining industry for their own needs, forcing them to often import refined gasoline from others, despite having some of the world's largest reserves of crude oil. So in other words, nearly all the industries in Russia depend on the nation's energy exports to keep functioning, either directly or indirectly. And ironically, even Russian energy imports rely on Russian energy exports to fund them. Yeah, it can be confusing. As with the Dutch economy in the 1960s, play by play, most of the money in the Russian economy starts in the energy industry, then trickles into other industries like restaurants, home builders, or other similar businesses. And on down the line it goes, until nearly every job in Russia can ultimately trace its roots back to these energy revenues. That makes Russia a major candidate for Dutch disease. Russia has all of the symptoms. When energy prices are high, Russia can earn a phenomenal amount of money, since their economy is specialized around this. But this also makes Russia incredibly vulnerable if the price of their energy exports ever drops, since they simply don't have a sufficient amount of other industries to make up the shortfall. In fact, Russia is so overextended that things can actually become bad enough to lead to a full-on societal collapse. And that's not mere speculation, because this has already happened. This exact thing took down the Russian economy in the not-so-distant past, just a little over 30 years ago with the collapse of the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union fell apart for many reasons, but one of the main contributing factors was this over-reliance on oil revenues. This is going to start to sound really familiar. For a time, when oil prices were high, it made the Soviets' communist economy look extremely strong. Many even touted it as an economic miracle, something that seemed, for a short period, to be superior to the capitalist systems of the West. But, you guessed it, when oil prices then fell in the 1980s and 1990s, it turned out that the Soviet economy couldn't stand up to the pressure. To prolong their existence without falling into bankruptcy, the Soviet leaders sold off the rights to many state industries to today's Russian oligarchs in order to raise cash. And the rest, as they say, is history. What happened to the Soviet economy as a whole is similar to what happens to a company town when the main factory or mine shuts down. Everything else that depended on that factory or mine starts to crumble, and the town simply cannot continue to exist in its current form. This, in turn, created knock-on effects that Russia still struggles with today. Like laborers who leave the company town to find more work after the shop closes, the Soviet Union saw many of its most talented people leave the country as its empire came crashing down around it. Those who had the skills needed to rebuild the economy were then gone, making recovery difficult, if not impossible in the short term, and even perhaps the long term, something that became known as Soviet brain drain. This then prevented the Russian economy from developing past the resource dependency that brought the Soviet Union down when the Russian Federation popped back up in the Soviet Union's place. And because of that, today we have videos like this one. But just because this example of a collapse caused by Dutch disease happened to the Soviet Union, does that really mean it could happen to modern Russia? Well, why not? Believe it or not, the Russia of today actually has it even worse than its Soviet predecessors did. Consider this. What many people don't realize is that while modern Russia has access to natural resources in vast quantities, just because you have a lot of natural resources doesn't mean you can just pull up easy money out of the ground whenever you want. That's not how things work. After all, the reason Russia has so many natural resources in the first place is because it owns Siberia, one of the largest landmasses on Earth that is also extremely remote and almost completely uninhabited due to its extremely harsh weather. But this same set of facts also means that it is incredibly expensive and incredibly risky for Russia to extract most of its resources. And it's also expensive and risky to transport them across a continent before anyone can even consider buying them. For that reason, for much of Russian history, many of its natural resource reserves have sat undeveloped, simple theoretical blots on a map that have been almost useless for any practical purposes. In the days of the Soviet Union, profits came a lot easier, because it was possible to extract most of their oil and gas from fields in the west, around the Caucasus near Georgia, or closer to the Ural Mountains, where the weather was comparatively far tamer, and where things were much closer to Russian civilization and to the European markets that Russia sold to. But because these were the prime energy fields, they were also the energy fields that got used up first. And now, many of these historical fields have largely been tapped out, or are at risk of being tapped out, causing production to be rationed and slowed. And that means that Russian energy production today must increasingly rely on more expensive and more risky energy fields further in the Siberian wilderness. So if the Soviet Union caved under the pressures of Dutch disease, even with access to much more profitable energy fields, the risk for modern Russia is only that much greater. And that's especially true since modern Russia can't rely on the economies of the Soviet satellite states, like Ukraine, to help support it. Instead, Russia is now obviously engaged in an active war against Ukraine, causing a further drag on its economy. What's more, the Soviet Union might have experienced a brain drain after its collapse, as we mentioned earlier, but at least for the Soviets, that came after their bout with Dutch disease, not during or before. In contrast, modern Russia is currently having to contend with a brain drain today, while it is undergoing both Dutch disease and war, as many of its skilled workers that could help create other economic sectors have fled the country in huge numbers to escape the war in Ukraine and its impacts. And when one considers that another major contributing factor to the collapse of the Soviet Union was its failed invasion of Afghanistan that overextended the empire at the same time the oil revenues collapsed, the parallels become truly chilling. A country that spends beyond its means on military adventures, while neglecting the broader needs of its economy at home, is setting itself up for future failure. Who would have thought? The dangers are so obvious that in the past, Vladimir Putin himself even acknowledged them. Before the invasion of Ukraine, Putin often cited the economic mismanagement of the Soviet Union as a cautionary tale. But now, despite his own warnings, Russia is doing exactly the same thing, overextending itself militarily while failing to diversify its economy and invest in long-term growth. For example, the costs of the ongoing war have quickly eroded Russia's financial reserves, with a projection that 40% of Russia's official 2025 budget will be allocated just to military and national defense. The opportunity cost of this spending is enormous, especially at a time where the nation's revenues are being so heavily depleted due to sanctions. And it means that other essential sectors in Russia, like healthcare, education, and infrastructure, which were already behind standards, are now falling even further to the wayside. You might think things couldn't get any worse, but as it turns out, we've only just scratched the surface. Because inside of Russia, in their local economies, there is also a new form of Dutch disease taking place that the Soviets never had to contend with. This is an interesting phenomenon in and of itself. You can think of it as a layer of Dutch disease on top of the existing Dutch disease. For you children on the playground, you can call it double Dutch disease, or, as I like to call it, a Russian nesting doll of Dutch disease. Russians do love their nesting dolls after all, apparently even when it comes to debilitating economic trends. And we might as well give it the name of a childish toy, since that about reflects how seriously the Russian government seems to be taking this, refusing to end their war against Ukraine to address the underlying problems. I call it a Russian nesting doll of Dutch disease because inside of this broader Russian economy, already afflicted by Dutch disease at a national level, Russia's local microeconomies are also separately beginning to fracture and break apart on their own, for completely different reasons. The Wall Street Journal has recently released some fascinating reports, covering the Russians living in small Siberian cities or towns who are getting rich, by local standards, from the military payments the government has been doling out. These payments come in several forms, including recruitment bonuses, high military pay, and death payments. And while many of these payments have been intentionally delayed by the Russian government, the war has now been going on long enough for some people to finally begin seeing them in their bank accounts. In many cases, these payments will give people more money in a single month than they could previously expect to earn in an entire year. Or, in the case of death payments, even a lifetime. According to the Wall Street Journal, many of those payments are in turn being spent on luxury goods and services, with people doing things like buying fur coats that they then wear to eat at fancy restaurants every evening. This influx of cash is then, in turn, fated to cause strange trends in local Russian economies, very similar to what happened in the Netherlands after the discovery of the Groningen gas fields. People will leave the productive local industries to either live on the military pay proceeds directly or indirectly, enjoying higher pay than normal in the services sectors that serve those who want to spend their military payouts. This has contributed to a massive labor shortage in other sectors across Russia, weakening the economic foundations of these communities and the country as a whole. Of course, once the war ends, or the government can no longer afford these payments, these influxes of fast cash will stop, meaning that these booms are completely unsustainable. But by the time the money runs out, there's a good chance that many local companies and industries will already be gone forever. This is worse than regular Dutch disease, because at least with a resource dependence, you can be reasonably sure that the resource will continue to bring in some profits. The same cannot be said, though, of payments that are coming from the government. And that means that Russia's economy, both on a national and a local level, is now a ticking time bomb. All it needs is a small push to fall completely over the edge. But this Dutch disease is just one facet of Russia's economic woes. Simultaneously, there are many other worrying trends going on, combining to create a highly predictable eventual result. This video has been long enough already, though, so for more on that, with more details on Russia's crumbling economy, be sure to check out the second part of this analysis in my other video here on screen. And if you enjoyed this video, can I ask you something? Would you consider becoming a patron and supporting this channel? It's completely voluntary, and we don't plan to lock anything behind a paywall, so don't worry about that. But we enjoy making analysis like this, and your support helps us conduct more research and produce more videos like this one. So if you got something of value from this video, and you'd like to get involved, just scan the QR code on screen or click the link in the description of this video. Don't forget to subscribe, and we'll see you on the next one.